Okay, Farhan, it is over to you. So take us away and perhaps introduce our speaker for the day.
Absolutely. So before I sort of drive you into completely into the session, I'd quickly share my screen and tell you what journey are we going to be taking today. So this is essentially where we are. This is a three-part series, but it's all encapsulated in one session. What we are going to be doing is we are going to be going from zero to apps. We are going to be creating the Snowflake database for data application. We are going to be connecting and servicing applications from API, and then we're going to be looking at visualization. So think of this essentially as one session that is divided into three parts, where we'll tell you different types of deployment models, managed, connected, and native application frameworks in Snowflake. Then we'll talk about how do you connect these applications, and then we'll show you how you can build really nice and complex visualizations using the Snowflake. So this is the journey that we are going to take, and we are joined by no other than Alan Mitchell, who is our principal data platform engineer. He's from the field CTO office, and our team today is going to deliver this content to you in three parts. Alan is going to be talking about the deployment model that we have in Snowflake, and then also how you can create a database for a data application. And I will highly recommend that we take this entire journey together. And at the end of it, we're going to be running a small survey of sorts. So if you're still there with us at the very end, we'd like to ask you some questions, solicit some feedback, and see how we could have done this a little better. But with that, no further ado, I will hand it off to Alan now. Alan is our resident veteran. He's been up very early in the morning for us. So it's over to you, mate.
Thank you very, very much. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay, good. So you should be seeing my screen. Thank you very much, David and Farhan. So we should, so you can see my screen.
Looks good.
Yep, it's here.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to be going through zero to application with Snowflake. So the agenda for today will be, we'll do an introduction and we'll set the scene about what we're going to create. And I think my colleague Frederick on the intro before David set it up very well. So there's going to be three parts, as Farhan said. I'm going to set up the database. So I'm going to make sure that we have data to consume. We have roles that will consume it. We'll have a warehouse that's able to compute over that data. And then Venkat in the second session will build that API. He's going to build an API that will talk to Snowflake, right? So it will use authentication, and we'll show you different models around that as well. And then finally, Many in the third session will be building a UI over the top of the API, which consumes from Snowflake. So that's our intention of what we're going to show you how to build today. So it's very iterative. And as I'll say in the slides, it's not all slides. It's interleaved with labs. And as David mentioned, we're going to make the quick start available. I've got a local build of the quick start here, but we're going to make that available publicly and generally, hopefully in the upcoming days. Okay. So our goals for today are, like I said, to build that application, that classic three-tier application over the top of Snowflake and Express and Node.js. And the way that we've approached this is that we've worked backwards from the end product. So we've looked at what do we need to produce, and we've worked backwards from there. And I'll go through more about what that means in a minute. And then once we know what we're working towards, we'll build forwards from the back end to the front end. As I've just mentioned, we're going to interleave labs to get hands-on with the technology. And once the quick starts out, all of you will be able to do pretty much exactly what you're going to see us do. And we're going to implement our simple websites. So we're going to do a front end, which is in React, it'll call middle tier an Express.js, which will use data in Snowflake. And as Venkat will say later, this is what we've chosen, right? So this is what we've chosen. What you choose to implement your front end and middle tier in is absolutely up to you. We will meet you where you are, right? So we've just chosen to implement it in this. Okay, so when I said that we work backwards from what we want and then we build from the back forwards, what does that actually mean? So if we start at the end and work backwards, what we're doing is we're making our users' experiences the goal, right? So that means that we don't end up building things that we think people might want. If we work forwards, then we end up building things we think that people might want, not what they actually need or what they've told us they need, but what we imagine that they would need. And that's not necessarily a good user experience at the other end. And then once we know what the users want or how people are going to consume our data, the different personas and what have you, then we can build forward. So we'll assemble the data in the necessary format, we'll layer on top an API, we'll put a user-friendly front end to convert those business questions into data and display the information. So you can see that we've gathered all the information, and then taking that, we're now working forwards to build it. Okay, so our example today is Tasty Bites. So Tasty Bites is a food business, and it enables food truck franchises, and it's a full service platform. So you'll see in our quick starts, we've got different parts of the Tasty Bites journey. Today we're doing 0 to app, but there's other parts as well there. So I highly recommend going and looking at our quick starts and having a look and trying out some of those other ones that are part of the Tasty Bites family. In there's an order service, payment processing, customer sentiment, and analytical services. But today we're going to be concentrating on the orders service. And Tasty Bites is a global food network. So as I'll show you when we come to look at the data, we've got localized menu options. We're available in 15 countries, 30 major cities, and we have 15 core brands. So within the Tasty Bites data set, there's a good variation on different countries, different menus, different buying habits, etc. And we'll have a look at some of those characteristics of the data as we go through. And we want to build a dashboard, right? So we want, and this is going to be for the franchise owners. And that what they want to do is they want to see key statistics about their franchise and truck brands. And the data that they will see will be based on sales data that we've captured within Tasty Bites. And what it will do is it will allow for a high level and detailed access of the underlying data about how well their businesses are doing, or potentially not, what lines are selling very well, where they're selling, maybe days of the week that they're selling. It'll give them all of that insight into the buying patterns with their trucks in their franchises around these different countries that I've just mentioned. So here's a high-level architecture. So remember, this is what we've chosen. So we've chosen to build the user interface layer. So it's a classic 3-tier. So we've chosen to build the user interface layer in React. Building our API layer, that middle layer, in Express. And of course, the persistence layer at the back is Snowflake. And as I said earlier, those first two layers, you can swap out for whatever technology is pertinent to you in your business. Yeah, but it's just that we've chosen to use this particular technology stack. Okay, so when we go and speak to people about building applications over the top of Snowflake, there's certain things, in order for us to be able to design correctly, there's certain things that we're going to have to ask, and these are the business questions. And we'll be asking these questions of ourselves as tasty bites later on in the deck. So the first thing that we want to know when we go out and we try to build something is, for whom are we building and what are we building? So we first need to understand who are the consumers of our apps, right? Because that shapes what they're potentially going to want to do with our application. We then need to know what their business needs are. So what is it that they're going to get from this app? We want to make this app useful. So what is it that they need to get out of this application to be able to help them in their day-to-day life? Then we can build those domain-specific questions, and it'll only be in English at this time. So we can say, I want to be able to see the top 10 performing trucks in this particular city for the last 7 days. That might be an example of a question that we might want to answer, yeah, and that we might want to visualize in our application. And then we can think about how people want to consume. Generally, users like to see visuals, so they like to see something like a graph or a chart, but others are more rows and columns based. So maybe they want to see a grid of data. Maybe people prefer to read data, but we need to, everything's possible, right? So we need to find out what would make it more valuable for our users when they look at our data. And who are our end personas? So how many different types of users do we have? Do we have things like data wranglers? Do we have business non-technical users? Do we have machine learning, data scientists, ETL developers? Yeah, are we going to make this available to the public? Is this going to be widely shared? What is it? Who are our end personas that we're trying to satisfy with this application? Yeah, what role do they have? The CFO, for example, will have probably very different requirements to your warehouse stockist. So maybe you're looking at what am I selling most often, and how do I stock? How do I make sure that I have enough stock? That's going to be very different to the like I said, the CFO, who might be more concerned with, okay, show me revenue by brand, by truck, by country, and show me any peaks and troughs and that type of thing, right? So there's very different requirements there. What's their skill sets? So some people will be less technical than others. So maybe people want those charts, those grids, and maybe some people actually want to be able to interact with it more dynamically. So they're more data wranglers. Maybe they want to see data and they want to ask different questions and slightly tilt those questions each time they ask them. What they worry about, as I said earlier, what is it that it's more part of what is it that we're trying to get out of this app? What is the purpose of our app? Is it just informational? So is this just something that we might have up on the wall in the office showing brand sales? Is it to make a decision? So we want to, as I said, resource allocation. So maybe we need to put another truck into another area because we're seeing huge demand for a certain brand of food, a certain cuisine. Maybe that's something that we would be keen to know. Maybe we need to reduce the amount of trucks. Maybe we need to repurpose those trucks. Yeah, all of those things. Is it for decision making? And how up to date do we need our data to be? Usually when you ask people how up to date they want it like that. And very often that's not the case. But it could be that overnight is perfectly happy. Could be that you want to refresh the data every hour. But these are the kind of questions that we really need to start asking our data. Yeah, or be able to understand when people go and query our data, how fresh is that data? Okay, so based on these questions, going to have based on these personas, sorry, we're going to have some questions. So we put down some easy questions here. So what are my daily sales totals over the past week or month? Which trucks are performing the best? Is there a correlation between sales and end day of week? And I'm sure you can imagine a whole load more, but during the session, we'll give you a good selection of queries that you can use, but you can imagine that you could add queries to this, and then you can start exploring the data. Once you get the quick start, you'll be able to start, maybe how do I ask this question, or how do I ask that question? And our data set will allow you to explore that data in full. So as I mentioned, we're Tasty Bites, right? We're building this application. We are now the application builders. So I've just told you that we would normally start with asking questions. So that's exactly what we need to do now. So for us, who are our end personas? Our end personas are the franchise owners, right? And they are concerned with sales, forecasting, efficiency. They're not particularly technical, so maybe we're thinking about graphs and charts. And they like to use web pages or mobile apps, Excel and Word, etc. So what's the purpose of our app? So we're going to cover off sales reporting, so sales visibility, high level, and some with details. Like I said, what's our top 10 selling line items by country during the month of October 22, that type of thing. And how up to date does the information need to be realistically? Well, for us, it's overnight. So it's as of yesterday. So maybe we have a scheduled task which runs every morning at 1 a.m. and refreshes that data set. So that for us is perfectly fine. What information do we want to see? So when we do visualize this data, what is it that we've been told that we want to see? And we want to see things like top 10 countries based on revenue in a time window, top 10 truck brands based on revenue in a time window, year-to-date revenue by month by truck brand. So we're going to have two different types of queries today. We're going to have the franchise queries, which I've just gone through, and then we're going to have those truck brand level queries, right? So we're getting into slightly more detailed granularity. And that could be total sales by day of the week, top selling items by day of the week, and best cities by day of the week. And you can imagine that some of these are going to help with things like resource allocation, right? So we're going to be able to start to look and say, okay, in city X on a Thursday, we're not seeing that many sales. So maybe we want to take it over to this other city or this other location where they are seeing a whole lot more sales, and we'll be able to allocate our trucks more efficiently and maximize those sales, because maybe one's overloaded, one's underutilized. So let's try and equalize that. And we'll be able to do that with our data set, with our visualizations, which will show that. Okay. At the base of everything is the data, right? Without data, we have nothing. So let's look at the data that we're going to use today. Okay, so data, we need to know what data our personas need. So like I said, today what we're doing is we're looking at orders data. And that orders data, that data that we need to be able to visualize it later on may already exist in our organization, but it might not. And if it doesn't exist in our organization already, then maybe we need to get it from another business unit in our organization. Maybe we need to purchase it from a third party, and the Snowflake marketplace would be a fantastic place to augment your existing data sets with data sets from third party, be they paid or free. Fantastic resource to do that, and very easy, and it means that you don't have to go source it yourself. You just look it up. And there's also public data sets out there, right? So there's all public data sets. They might not be clean, so maybe we need to do a little bit of data cleansing as well. And maybe we do have the data, but it's not necessarily in one place. So maybe we need to go in our organization. So maybe we need to go to those different places, get it together, do some cleaning. So your classic extract, load, transform. So we'll go get it and we'll do the loading into Snowflake, and then we'll do our transforms over that data and make it into something that we can actually go ahead and use. So there's different choices. So this part here is important, and I often talk with customers about this, is the data layout and multi-tenancy. Right? So there's different ways of laying out your data within Snowflake for consumption by an API, right? So you can mix the tables, you can mix the tenants into the same tables. So that might be a multi-tenant table. And it's the simplest way of doing things. There's economy of scale. Yeah, for data ingest, you're inserting into the same table for all of your tenants. And you can lock down access through row access policies, nice and simple. If that doesn't work for you and you need to separate out, you can absolutely create separate tables for each of your tenants. So for us, a tenant is a franchise. So you could create those orders table franchise 1, orders table franchise 2, and you could absolutely split those out. It becomes more complex as you have more franchises. It becomes more complex to manage. It's absolutely doable, but it becomes more complex to manage. But it is easy to lock down with role-based access control. So you absolutely still have that security layer where franchise 1 could only see franchise 1, franchise 2 could only see franchise 2, and you can absolutely do that. And that is a valid model. And so if I just build this, so if we look at this, so you'll see that this is the multi-tenant table, right? So we've got our franchise owners at the bottom there, and they're coming through the applications here, and all of the compute and all of the data is commingled. Right? So they all use the same compute and they all use the same database and the same tables. And we've used row access policies to divide out who can see what data based on who you are. So I'm franchise owner 1, I can see franchise 1. And here's where we've done object per tenant, or OPT. So the previous one was MTT, this is OPT. And this is where you might come in and you've got individual tables or databases for each tenant. So this is where you've now segregated the data. So so the application just needs to point to the right table. There's no row access policies here. And then finally, we come to the most segregated group. So this is account per tenant. So this is where each of your franchises, you'd have franchise 1 account, franchise 2 account, franchise 3 account, and that provides the ultimate level of separation. So you can see as we've gone through this, you can see that there's super simple, way with multi-tenant tables, and you can control who sees what using row access policies, nice and simple. But if you want slightly more separation, there's object per tenant, where we use RBAC, and then you've got account per tenant. All of these are valid models, but there are trade-offs, and we'll come to that in a second. So these are the things that we've discussed. So the multi-tenant table generally, it'll scale to thousands of tenants and beyond, right? Because we'll just add data, and we can just filter, and the logic's really easy, right? And we don't have a whole load of tables and objects, artifacts to manage. So objects per tenant, generally we recommend no more than the tens to hundreds of tenants, not because it can't be done, but because it's then becomes a management exercise on your behalf, right? So absolutely it can be done, but then remember, if you are super successful, and we obviously all hope that we are, if Tasty Bites is super successful and has 1,000 franchises and each franchise needs an object per tenant, then we're going to have a thousand instances of everything that we do potentially. So that could be a database, that could be a table. So it starts to become a little unmanageable. And then you've got account per tenant, and that's again tens of tenants, because you've got to think that you're managing all of these accounts, and you could do things like Terraform and what have you to manage it, but it's still that extra management. So that's just something to think about. Different models, absolutely all possible. Just think about, okay, what am I going to have to do later on? And we see a lot of this, and this is very often the model that we see. It's a mix between MTT and OPT, right? So you will generally have MTT, multi-tenant tables, but maybe you've got a couple of franchises which are super noisy, right? So maybe they are they're bigger than others, and they need more compute, and they ask different questions, or their data's in a different shape. Yeah. That might be where you make them an object per tenant, but people in general will be multi-tenant, multi-tenant tables, and that is a very, very valid model. Is this, because you don't want the noisy neighbor to be consuming all of the resource, all of the pooled shared resources, which will give a bad user experience for your other franchises. Okay, so what's our data look like? So, like I said earlier, we're going to be consuming orders data, and the orders data for us will look something like this. So we'll have franchise IDs, truck IDs, the brands, when was the order done, what was the menu item, what's the price of the. So your typical orders data, remember, so where trucks would go around, we sell X, and we sell it for a price, and people make an order. They might have 2 of these, 1 of those, 3 of those. So that makes up an order. So you can see how this all fits in and adds together. We're going to store it in a multi-tenant table because it's super simple, and we can. And we're going to be controlling access via queries and predicates. It's simpler and more scalable. And as I said, each franchise is a tenant. Okay, so let's go and have a look at our data set then. So if we look at this is the quick start that you're going to get. And in the quick start, I just wanted to give you a quick look. In the quick start, you'll see that we'll set out the overview. We'll also tell you the tooling that you need to install in order to be able to run through this whole of the quick start. But we'll start with quick start. We'll start with the lab one. And here what we're going to do is we're going to set up Snowflake, right? So we're going to create a role. We're going to create a warehouse for the data exploration, and it'll have things like the warehouse size, should we auto suspend, which you should do, how many clusters. So that you'll notice that min cluster count, max cluster count is 1. That means that this is a single cluster warehouse, so we won't be able to scale for concurrency should we need it. But in Venkat's session, he'll show you how to change that and make it scale out. Then what we need to do is we need to create a database. We need to create our orders table within the database after we created the schema. Then what we do is we create a load warehouse. So we'll have a load warehouse specifically designed for loading data. We'll go and get some data from this open repository, and we'll copy that data into our orders table. And then we'll use the query warehouse, and we'll just have a little look at that data. So let's go and have a look at what that looks like. So if I switch over to lab one. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to do is we're going to use our role account admin, which I'm already account admin. So I'm going to create a warehouse. So I'm going to create our query warehouse. Yeah, So I've created our query warehouse. Now what I need to do is I need to create our database, create our schema. And I'm going to, so you see now we're in Frosty Tasty Bites, and we're in the app schema. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create our orders table. So all of this SQL, as you've seen, is in the quick start for you. I'm going to create our load warehouse. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a stage. And we're going to load into our orders table from that stage. So we're copying the data from that open stage that's in S3, and we're copying it into our orders table. So this is setting us up for later, right? So all of the application, the API that we will build later on, the queries that we want to build, they'll all be sat on top of this orders data. So hopefully this shouldn't take too long. There's a fair few rows of data. So let's have a look at how many. So let's just have a do we do a count? Yeah, so let's go and have a look at what our orders data looks like. So you can see here that we've got order ID, truck ID, order timestamp, order detail ID, line numbers, all of the things that you expect from order data. Let's have a look at the time frames. So the time frame is important. So the minimum order time is the 1st and the 1st, 2022, and the last is the 31st and the 10th, 2022. So this is the time range that we have in there. And finally, let's go and have a look at sales by month over all of that data set. Yeah, so you can see that in January we sold whatever that number is there. Yeah, so let's just do one more query. So let's just have a look at count stars. So you can see that we've got 231 million rows. So it's not an inconsequential amount of data. Cool. So that's our data loaded. We've created our warehouses, so we know that the data is loaded and ready to be consumed. Okay. So now we need to turn our business questions into queries. So we've got the data, and we know what questions in English the users want to ask. So let's turn those into SQL queries. Some of the things that you'll be able to use within Snowflake to help you improve the performance for certain types of queries are things like warehouse sizing. So you saw when I was creating those load query, that load warehouse, the query warehouse, they can be different sizes, right? So based on your personas, based on their needs, you can have the warehouses be different sizes. So it's not a one size fits all, right? So it might be that you only ever need an extra small warehouse because your quick queries are really light and quite snappy and brilliant. But for loading all of those 231 million rows, we used a large warehouse, but you only pay for what you use. So it we didn't use that much time. So maybe it would have taken twice as long if we'd have used a medium warehouse. So we used a large. Auto clustering. So that's how we cluster the data. Search optimization service is a fantastic service for those needle in a haystack type of queries, right? So you've got maybe in that 231 million row table, we've got a specific piece of data that only appears once, and we want to find that. Search optimization service is a fantastic way of being able to find that. And we have things like materialized views. So you can materialize certain data sets, and we can optimize queries that you issue with those materialized views. And the aim is to have good clustering of our data. So based on our predicates, our wheres, our joins, we want to be able to have good clustering so we can find that data really easily. We can get rid of the data that we don't need to look at, so pruning, and that will give us the best performance. So even if you've got a huge amount of data, if we can get rid of 99% of that, we're only looking at 1% of your data, right, in order to be able to find it. So good pruning is good performance. So here's some of our queries. So we've got top 10 countries for January the 1st to March the 31st for franchise 1. So these are some of the queries that we're going to be using, and Venkat will cover over these queries again in the next session when he plugs them into our API. So you'll see that in this, we've particularly filtered by a particular franchise ID. So let's go ahead and let's create some SQL queries. So as I said, we're looking at Tasty Bites from two different angles. We're looking at it from the franchise point of view, and we've got some queries based on the franchise. And we've also got some queries at the brand level. So things like total sales for the brand by day of the week, top selling items, total sales by location and day of the week. And that's that, like I said before, is really helps us understand the pattern of sales within our business. So our data is telling us we do good sales on a Tuesday in location X with food brand Y. We're not doing so well over here. We're overstocked with trucks in this particular area. Maybe we could reallocate them to other areas, maximize our sales, and all of this will help us, right? And the franchise is more global, so we're going down in that type of level of granularity. So we're going to focus on one franchise. That's franchise number 1, which you saw in a previous example, and a particular truck brand. And we're going to limit our time window to, like I said, the start of January to the end of March. And we'll parameterize those things in the next session. So let's again just jump out, and I'll show you some of those queries. Okay. So again, let's jump into our database, and let's use our account admin. We're already account admin. I've cheated and I've used I've already set our database to Frosted Tasty Bites using the UI. So I've changed our context to Tasty Bites on the app schema. And here's our franchise queries, right? So we're doing top 10 of country over price, and from app orders, we're filtering on a date range and a franchise. And Snowflake is Snowflake's bread and butter, right? So the way that we store data, the way that we cluster data, this type of query is bread and butter to Snowflake. This is really, so these type of analytical queries are really one of our sweet spots. So let's go ahead and let's have a look at that. So we're ordering by summer price descending. So you'll be able to see for those top 10 countries. So let's go ahead and execute that. So you can see here, you can see Canada is the top with those sales there. And that query of those 231 million rows, I think it was, took 2.3 seconds. Yeah. And this is with our query warehouse. So top 10 truck brands based on revenue. So again, we do top 10 truck brand names, some price. We order by the sum of the price, filtering, specifying our filters. So you'll see here that Smoky Barbecue is the truck brand name of choice, and its revenue you can see there as well. Monthly revenue per truck brand. So here we've got country and we've got the date. So the date is the month ID, and we can see the revenue. So here for Canada, you can see in 10th, 7th, 5th, 4th, 6th. So you could order that by month to see a trend, perhaps. So you could see whether the trends for a particular country are falling off or increasing or whatever you want to do. And then we look at truck brand queries. So like I said, we've gone franchise and we're now down to the truck brand queries. And we're looking at whack and roll, and we're looking at a particular filter there. So let's go ahead and let's look at that. As you can see that the day of the week, and you can see the sales for this particular franchise, for this particular truck brand, for this particular date range. Yeah, so you can see all of these queries are really quite snappy over a not non-representative size of data. So again, let's have a look at franchise ID, and let's look at the most popular menu items. So the Leon Burrito Bowl is our most, it beats the chicken burrito. So it seems burritos, and burritos are the third in line as well. So it would seem that burritos for whack and roll are our thing. Finally, let's just have a look at top selling items by day of the week. Yeah, so again, you can see chicken burrito on a Sunday, so 259,000. Yeah, so you can see all of the data there. So you can see that those are the types of questions that we're going to want to ask of our data. Right, so now what we've done is we've set up Snowflake. So Snowflake has the data, Snowflake has the it has the warehouses to be able to query. We've loaded our data into Snowflake. We've also generated some queries. So we've got our queries, we've tested them. They seem to do exactly what we need them to do. So we know that the data that we want to be able to, or the questions that we want to be able to ask, we can ask of our data set. So we tested that out. So we're pretty happy now. Right, so that brings us now to the third part, which is where we need to set up our Snowflake production environment, right? So our application, our middle tier application needs to be able to connect to Snowflake. It needs to be able to authenticate to us. It needs to be able to pass parameters to us. We need to make sure that it's allowed to come in. So we're going to have to set up things like roles and users and permissions on that. So let's go ahead and do that in this section. Okay. So the API is going to issue SQL to our Snowflake environment, and it's going to issue SQL just like we've just seen me do in our data wrangling part there. And we're going to need to set up some things for the API layer. So we're going to need to set up a user, we're going to need to set up role, login credentials, and warehouses, right? So we're creating different types of warehouses for different types of needs. And because we've got pause on, so after a period, a period of inactivity, those warehouses will tear themselves down. So we're reducing our costs, making our data exploration, our data application very, very cost effective. We've not got this always on when we're not using it. Okay, so there's different ways that you could authenticate to Snowflake from your API. So how many database users do we want to do? A very, very, very common model is to just have one service role for all API calls. So you'll go into the API as user one, and the API will connect to Snowflake as a service user, so as a service role. It's the most common use case. And you handle authorization in the API, right? So you say, okay, user one, right? Okay, user one, I'll authenticate you in my API layer, but I'm going to go to Snowflake as service account one. Or you could choose to have every user that comes into the application be authenticated as that particular user to Snowflake. It's more complex, and it's typically not necessary, but you could leverage OAuth flows for that. Access in Snowflake, as you may already know, is based on roles. So we don't permission users onto individual resources. Users are part of roles, and roles have access to warehouses, tables, stages, whatever. There's different methods of logging into Snowflake, and two discussed here are username and password. Super simple, but it's not really a great option for a service account from a security perspective. And it's hard to rotate those credentials without disruption, right? So if you're going to rotate people's username and passwords, it's hard without disrupting somebody. And you've got key pairs. So that's generally a better choice for API usage. It's more secure. It's really easy to rotate your keys, and it's a zero downtime credential rotation. But it's zero time credential rotation, but do make sure that you rotate your credentials, right? The facility's there for you to rotate credentials. Just make sure that you do. So a quick one on tenancy designs for compute. So much like we had with storage, there's different designs for how you want to do compute. And this again will get more of a management overhead as you move to the right in this diagram. But this one's where you've got, so the multi-tenant compute is where you have pooled compute, and all of your users coming in will use that shared compute, and then they will all authenticate. They will all use that compute to consume the data. Really good for denseness, right? So you get good utilization per warehouse. Fantastic option. But maybe you want to use an individual compute by tenant. Absolutely possible, but remember, we're moving down now through the complexity of implementation or management. Yeah. So you can absolutely do that. And you could pair this with your compute, storage, sorry. And then you've got the account per tenant. So this is directly paired with the account per tenant for your storage as well, right? If you've got account per tenant for compute, most likely, almost certainly, you've got account per tenant for your storage as well. So this is when you want absolute separation. And generally we see that when it's based on legislation. Legislation usually dictates, some kind of legislation dictates that they have to be separated, truly separated. All of this is possible. Just remember your management. Okay. Pooled resources, like I said, is the simplest, and it makes for better utilization. If you've got many franchises in our instance coming in consuming the same compute, then that compute is going to be used more densely. So it's going to be used more often. It's going to be put to work. There's going to be less downtime. Separation of resources can be good because it does aid chargeback, right? So being able to split out who did what and how much did they consume is easier. As you start to split out those objects, it's much easier to separate who did what to what. And for us today, what we're going to do is we're going to use pooled tasty bytes, and we're going to use pooled compute for tasty bytes. And we're going to use separate, but as you saw, we're using separate computes for loading and for queries. So it's still pooled compute, but we had a loading warehouse, and we'll have a query warehouse as well. We're going to store data in a multi-tenant table, so that orders table is multi-tenant. We're going to use a service account, and we're going to use pooled compute. So like I said, there's different options, but this is what we have chosen to do for today. Much like we chose our front-end stack and our middle-tier stack, we'll meet you where you are. So there's different options for you in your business. And maybe once you get a quick start, you do try different ways of implementing this with that quick start. Maybe you change stuff. That's up to you. Okay, so what are we going to do in this final lab of this particular session? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create our service user, right? So this person is going to be called Tasty App API user, and I'm going to create a key pair for the user. I'll create a service role. So remember, we permission artifacts based on role, not user. And I'll create a warehouse for our application, so Tasty App API warehouse. And I'll grant permissions to that service role. So once we've created the user, we've created the role, we add the user to create the user, we'll add the user to the role, we'll then create a warehouse, and then I'll grant all the permissions so that when our API does come in, it's able to authenticate to us. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's look at lab 3. And we'll look at lab 3. Okay. So let's set up our context. I'm already in there. So let's go ahead and let's just set our context. Okay. So we've set our context. Now we've created our, we're in role admin. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to create that role. I'm going to create the role first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the privileges. So remember, you can see all of this in the quick start. So I'm going to grant usage on our database to the role. I'm going to grant usage on the schema. I'm going to grant select on all tables in the schema to the role. Granted, we've only got one table right now, but we won't have for very long. And then what I want to do, and this is a really cool feature within Snowflake, is you can say grant select on future tables. So you're saying if somebody goes and creates another table, grant select on that table to this user as well, right? Because I don't want to have to go back and do it later on. So I think it's a really cool feature. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay. We're going to create a user, but you'll notice here there's an RSA public key that we need. Okay. So before we do that, what we need to do is we need to go and generate some keys. So we're going to use OpenSSL to generate a public and private key, and then we're going to get the value of the public key, and we're going to copy it in and put it into here. And our API will use a private key, and we'll authenticate like that. Okay, so let's go out to go out to here. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to generate our key, or public key, private key, sorry. And based on that private key, I now want to create a public key. So this is for our authentication. So this is for our JSON web tokens, our JSON web token that we're going to be creating later. So you can see here that I'm going to create a public key from our private key. And now what I want to do is I now want to have a look inside that public key so I can fill in the last part of our users. So let me just highlight this. Let me just copy that. Okay, so I can go back to Snowflake and we've got our Tasty App API user. Let me just do that and let me do that. Okay, so let me go ahead and create that user. So I created that user, and if we describe the user, you can see down here, you can see it must change password. This is always set up with our default warehouse, our namespace, our role. Down here, you can see the RSA public key and the private key fingerprint as well. So good. It looks like we've created our user. Okay. So now what we want to do is, remember, we don't permission users. We've created our API role. So let's go ahead and add our user to our role. We'll create our API warehouse. We'll grant usage on our warehouse to our warehouse to our role. And now what we need to do is we need to create a users table, because we're going to connect to Snowflake from our API using a service account. But now what we want to do is we want to do that authentication in the middle tier, right? So users are going to come into us as franchise owner 1, right? And we want to make sure, okay, when you say franchise owner 1, do I know who you are? And do you have access? Right, so that's going to be created, and this table is going to store those credentials. So we'll create a users table. And we're going to insert a salted hash of the password into our users table. So you'll see that user 1, franchise 1, so there. Yeah. Current timestamp true, so the status is true, password date. Yeah, so we're just going to insert some of these, and you'll see these being used in the next session. So let me go ahead and insert that data. You can see that I've inserted those 3 rows. So we're now all set up, ready for our API. We've got that users table where the API can authenticate the user that's logging in through our website, which we're going to build. The API can connect to Snowflake using those public-private keys that we've just created, and we've created a user based on those public-private key pairs. And we've made sure that we've got a warehouse which is attached to that role, which we've added the user to which we've added the user. Right, so as far as the back end is concerned, as far as Snowflake's concerned, we have everything that we need now to be able to go ahead and build the API layer, and that's really important. So that we're now building on that really solid foundation. So I don't know. So I know that my colleagues have been sat inside the chat. I don't know if there's anything from the chat that needs to be covered off now, or if there's anything for me as we go through this, or whether all the chat questions have been answered.
Hey, Alan,
David?
Yeah, we've answered most. There's a couple of questions.
Brilliant.
So one of the question is, can we use a private key with passphrase for JDBC connectivity?
Yes.
All right. Second one is, how can we grant usage on future warehouses created?
Oh, I don't know that we have the command for, I don't think there's a grant usage on future warehouses, is there? So,
Yeah.
but generally you wouldn't, I'm not too sure as you'd want to either, right? Because warehouses are something that consume credits, so they consume expense. So I guess you'd want to control who has access to what particular warehouses. So you can imagine that if there was such a command, which I don't think there is, in fact, I'm pretty positive there isn't, you can imagine that maybe there's a requirement in a month's time to have a 6XL warehouse, right? For some reason, right? But it's only used by a very select few in your organization. If you granted that permission, if it existed, right, it means that role X would have permissions onto that 6XL, which means that they would see it appear, which means that they could consume it. And that might not be a good thing, right? Because you'd be using a 6XL for non-6XL types of things, and you'd potentially incur more costs. So I'm relatively happy that we don't have that, because it could be a cost. I would rather explicitly say warehouse, and what we've done today in this past hour and a bit is we've explicitly granted warehouses of certain sizes to certain roles, and I think that's the way that you should go as well. You just control those costs. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think David, we're going to take a little break now, but the chat should remain open throughout, David. So if there's questions that people are now digesting, or you want to go get a cup of tea and you come back and you think, oh, I wish I'd have asked that, please do carry on asking those questions, even though the next session might have started, and you asking questions about that. If there's something about this particular session that you've still got questions about, please do post in the questions and answers, and we'll answer those questions for you. So let's try and make this really interactive in the chat. So thank you very much. David?
Thank you so much. That was great, Alan. Exactly nailed it there. We're going to take a short break for 10 minutes. Farhan will bring us back in a moment. So fill up the coffee cup, the tea cup, grab a glass of water. If you've got questions, that we've still got a few hours left yet. So please take a short break, and we'll be back with you in a moment. And Alan, thank you so much for getting up at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning UK time. It was a great opportunity for all of us over in APJ to meet a few faces from our very talented principal team around the world. So thank you so much.
Not a problem. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Perfect. Thank you so much.